At the top of almost every modern website, you'll find a bold banner that rotates through announcements, highlights, or featured content. These are smooth and polished experiences that really set the tone for the user's experience on the website. Today, we're bringing that pattern into Power Apps by building the Fluent 2 Carousel component. We're going to recreate that premium look and feel provided by wide immersive banners that automatically cycle, pause when the user interacts with them, and lets users navigate through content without leaving the page. We'll break this down step by step, looking at the structure of our component, the formulas, as well as any of the logic that really makes this a reusable component that you can just drop into your app. By the end of this video, we'll have a clean and responsive banner carousel that follows Fluent 2 design. With that, let's take a look. Channel members have access to download the apps used in the videos, as well as the YAML code used in the components that I showcase. You can click the join button below the video if you're interested in supporting the channel. This component is fairly straightforward, although I think you'll find some useful techniques that can be used in many different scenarios. We'll start by creating a new component in our app called Fluent 2 Banner Carousel. Inside this component, we'll add a vertical container called Container Banner Carousel Component. We'll center align the container's contents, and we'll make sure to set the gap to 8, and then the padding on all sides to 8 as well. We'll also set the width to parent.width and the height to parent.height. Be sure to set the X and Y values of this container to 0 if they weren't already. Next, we'll disable the drop shadow on this container. Now inside our banner component container, we'll add a regular container called Container Carousel Overlay. We don't need to do much with this container, but just make sure it's set to stretch to the parent container's size and enable flexible height. We'll also set the border radius to 16 to give this more of a rounded, modern look. Inside this container, we'll add two things. The first will be an image control, and we'll name this Image Banner. We'll set the width of this image to parent.width and the height to parent.height. Importantly too, we'll set the image position property to fill. You can change this depending on how you want your images to adjust to the size of your component. We'll also set the X and Y values for this image to 0 as well. Next, inside of our Carousel Overlay container, we'll insert a vertical container called Container Carousel Content. For this container, we'll set the gap to 16 and the padding on all sides to 16 as well. Next, we'll do some manual formatting to make this more responsive in the container. So we'll set the X property to the minimum value of either parent.width divided by 2 minus self.width divided by 2, or 40. This will indent the messaging of the banner up to 40 if there's room, or start to shrink it to the left if there's less room in the parent container. For the Y property, we'll just vertically center this by entering parent.height divided by 2 minus self.height divided by 2. You can adjust this as well if you'd rather the messaging of the banner be on the top or lower third of the image. For the width property, we'll set this to the minimum value of either parent.width minus 40 or 350. That will make sure that we always have a padding of 40 on the right, but we can allow the message to expand up to 350. You can adjust this to your liking as well. We'll set the fill color of our container to white, and we'll give it a border radius of 12. Inside our carousel content container, we'll insert our controls to display information. The first one will be a text control named Label Carousel Title. We don't need to do much here except enable auto height, set the control to stretch with a minimum width of 0, and set the font size to 20 with a weight of semi-bold. This gives a very clear title for our carousel. Next, we'll insert another text control called Label Carousel Description. We'll again enable auto height and set the width to stretch with a minimum width of 0. With that done, we'll insert a button control called Button Carousel Action. For the visible property of this button, we want to only show this if there's actually text in the button. So we'll set this to isNotBlank self.text. We'll set the left and right padding to 0, and we want to give a quick and dirty auto width calculation for the button, so we'll multiply the length of self.text times 10. You can adjust this down to 9 or 9.5 if you prefer less space on the sides of your text. We'll also be sure to left align this button in the container. Next, we'll add a regular container to the content container, and we'll name this Container Carousel Content Auto Height. We just need this to have a height of 1, and we'll set the drop shadow to none. With that container created, we can go back to our content container and set the height property as our auto height container's Y property. As our text expands, our container will automatically adjust its height to accommodate the new height of the text. Before we get to the navigation part, I think it's best to add some of our custom properties. The first one we'll add is simply called items, and this will be a data input of type table. This will be the table of items that we populate our carousel with. For this property, we'll also want to make sure that we raise on reset when the value changes. The default value of this property is going to have a couple different columns, which we'll just populate with fake data now. We have an item key, a title, a description, button text, as well as an image. Here we're providing the schema of the information that will eventually populate our carousel. We use the sample image here because every app has access to that image, and that just tells our component to expect an image type for that field. I'll just go ahead and add a couple more sample records, and then we'll move on. Now we have our input of items, but we need to do some work to those items to add row numbers to them. Rather than doing this all in the input property, we'll create an output data table property, and this is what our component will mostly reference. We'll call this carousel items. For the default property, we'll need to use the add columns function on the sequence of how many records are in the items input property. The column we want to add in this case will be called carousel info, and the value we'll retrieve is the matching row from the items property. We can get this by using the index function on our items property, and we want to return the row number with the same number as our sequence number, which is referenced as value. The result of this formula is a table with a value column counting up from 1 to the number of rows in our items property. These rows also have an additional column called carousel info, which contains the actual data from the items record. The reason we're doing this may seem kind of confusing at first, but stick with me and it will all come together soon. We need row numbers associated with our input data because we need to know which carousel item is currently selected, which one came before it, and which one is coming next. This will allow us to auto-cycle through the carousel as well as let the user use arrows to navigate the items. Next, we'll start to create our navigation. In our carousel component container, we'll add a horizontal container named Container Carousel Navigation. We'll need to set the width to stretch with a minimum width of 0, and we'll set the height to 24. We don't want a drop shadow for this, so we'll set that property to none. If any gap or padding was added by default, you can go ahead and set those to 0. And lastly, we want to center justify the contents of this container. In this container, we'll start by adding a blank horizontal gallery. We'll call this gal carousel navigation, and we'll set a couple of properties initially. The template size for this gallery will be 24, and we'll also set the height to 24. The template padding is not needed, so we'll set this to 0. Inside the gallery, we'll add a regular container, and we'll call this container selected carousel item. We want to center this container vertically as well as horizontally. So for the X property, we'll enter parent.templateWidth divided by 2 minus self.width divided by 2. And for the Y property, we'll enter parent.templateHeight divided by 2 minus self.height divided by 2. We'll set the width and the height to 8 for now, and the border radius to 16. For the fill color of this container, we'll just set this to black, but you can change this as well. Inside this container, we'll insert an image called image selection. This image will purely just be providing an onSelect property for us to then trigger some code when the user selects this item. We'll set the image property to blank and the X and Y values to 0. We'll set the width and the height to parent.width and parent.height, and then we'll scroll down and set the tab index as 0. And this will give us a hand cursor effect when hovering over that transparent image. In the onSelect property, we'll set a variable called varSelectedItem, and we'll set this to this item. This will store whichever carousel item the user selects, and this variable will then drive our content as well as the image displays above. We'll need to go to our items property of the gallery and set this to our component's carousel items. Before we go any further, we'll want to add another custom property that will make things a little bit easier for us in development. Sometimes that varSelectedItem variable that we just created is going to be blank, and if that's the case, we want to be able to look at something on the component while we're trying to modify things. We'll create a data output property called SelectedItem, and this will be of type record. The default value of this should be the first non-blank value of either our variable or the first selected record of our carousel items custom property. This will make sure that if no variable is selected, we always at least see the first record's information while we're building our component. We'll go back to our container for the selected item and go to the width property. Here we want the width of this to be larger if the currently selected item is this item in the gallery. So we'll enter if this item.carouselinfo.itemKey is equal to fluent2banner carousel.selecteditem.carouselinfo.itemKey. Then we want the width to be 16, and if not, the width can be 8. Wherever we would typically reference our variable moving forward, we'll instead reference our selected item custom property. With our navigation partially set up, let's just make our gallery auto-expand its width to accommodate any new items. We'll set the width of our gallery to self.allitemsCount times self.templatewidth. Next, we want to add some navigation arrows on the right and left of our gallery. We'll first add a button called Button Carousel Next, and we'll position this after the gallery. We'll remove the text from this button and set the layout as icon only with a chevron right icon. The width and height properties should be set to 24, and we'll set the type of the button to transparent. We'll copy this button and paste a copy in the container, and then we'll rename this to Button Carousel Previous. This can go before the gallery, and the icon will be chevron left. Now for the actions of these buttons, we'll need to add a new custom property. We'll call this Change Item, and this will be an action property. We'll add a parameter for this called Direction, which will be a required text parameter. This parameter can either be next or previous, and that will tell our selected item to either move forward or backward. We'll set the default value of direction to next and then go to the change item property. Here we want to set varSelectedItem to either the next or the previous row in our carousel items custom property. To do this, we can insert an index function which will reference our carousel items. And the row we want to get is the current row value, which is stored in self.selecteditem.value. To this, we need to either add plus or -1, so we'll check if the direction is next, and if so, we'll add 1. If not, we'll add -1. Now this works up to a point, however, once we get to either end of the carousel, we want the carousel to loop back around to either the beginning or the end. The index function will cause an error if you try to return a row number greater than the number of rows in the table, so we need to account for that. We'll wrap our index function in an if error function, and if there's an error, we'll instead return the index of those carousel items, where if the direction parameter is next, we'll go back to row 1, or if not, we'll go to the last row in our table. We can get this by counting the rows in the carousel items property. Again, once we get to either end of the carousel, we want to loop back around to the other side. So this code will check if there's an error in the original index function, and if so, loop us in the direction we're trying to go. This ends up making our arrows pretty simple in their logic. For the left arrow, we'll simply reference the change item property and input previous as the value. And for the right arrow, we'll do the same, but inputting next. We can see our buttons at the bottom respond accordingly. Now we can populate our controls with our data. For our title, we'll reference the selected item property .carouselinfo.itemTitle. For the description property, we'll reference the same but item description. For our button, we'll reference the item button text. And finally, for the image, we'll reference item image. Now our component is mostly working, we just need to add a custom property to handle our button being clicked. We'll add a new event property called onSelect, and for this we'll add a parameter called item key. This will be a required text parameter. In our button's onSelect property, we can trigger this custom event, and we'll input the selected item.carouselitem.itemKey as the value to pass in. When we insert our component on the screen, we can use a switch statement to handle what to do when each carousel item is then selected. With that done, let's go head over to our screen and insert our control. We can see the template of our control on the screen, and if we just select some of the buttons for our navigation, we can see it scrolls through the different items. If we select our arrows, we can see it correctly loops us to each end of the carousel. Let's insert some items so we can see this a little bit better. Here I've added some items, and we can now see what our banner looks like. The banner is fully responsive, and our carousel allows us to view each item while still being able to cycle back to the beginning. We'll go to the onSelect property, and we'll insert a switch statement here. We'll switch on the item key, and if that item key is equal to tTime, then we'll just say that we're going to launch google.com. If we try to click register, we can see this takes us over to Google. Whereas if we're on a different banner image that does not meet the tTime item key, it does nothing. Now there's still some additional functionality we can add to this. In this case, we might want an auto-scrolling feature, and that would allow our banner to move through each item automatically. We'll head back over to our component, and we'll first go to the advanced properties and select our onReset. In the onReset property, we're going to do two things. The first thing is we'll set varSelectedItem to the first value from self.carouselItems, and that'll just make sure that every time we reset our component, our variable is reset to the first option. In addition to that, we'll set a variable called varStartTimer, and we'll set this to true. Whenever our component is reset or initially loaded, we want this start timer variable to be set to true, and we'll use this to control a timer that will autoplay our carousel items. Next, in our component, we'll insert a timer control, and we'll call this timer autoplay. In our timer's onTimerEnd property, we want to trigger our change item custom property and move this in the next direction. That'll continually move our selected item every time our timer ends. We can set the duration to a different value here, or you could link this to a custom property if you'd like, but for now we'll just set this to 5,000, and that'll be equal to 5 seconds. We want the repeat option to be set to true, because every time this repeats, we want it to start to count down and ultimately move to the next carousel item. The start property here is going to be set to our varStartTimer. Whenever that variable is set to true, we want our timer to start counting down. We'll also enable the auto start option. Again, this is pretty straightforward, but basically when our timer ends, we want it to move to the next item. So let's go back to our app, and we'll just play our app here, and we can see our timer counting up. And once it gets to 5 seconds, it moves on to the next item. When we're on the last item, we can see it goes back to the beginning. Now, what happens when the user interacts with the carousel while the timer is going? We want to avoid the situation where the user clicks one of the items, but the timer is about to end, so it immediately goes to the next item. Typically, websites will pause the auto rotation of the items once the user interacts with the carousel, and we can do that same functionality here. We'll go to our previous button, and in the onSelect property, after the change item action is called, we can set our var start timer variable to false. We'll copy that code, and we can put that in our image selection, as well as our next button. You could also add this in your carousel action button if you'd want to stop the timer when the user interacts with the actual carousel button. If we go back to our screen, we can see our timer is counting up. If we select one of these items, the timer doesn't actually stop, and that's because right now that variable is blank for var start timer, so it doesn't actually get set to false or make a difference here. So we can make a small change here that when the timer ends, we instead set var start timer to true. And that'll just make sure that our variable gets updated every time the timer ends. If we let it run once, now our variable should be set to true. And if we move to the next item, now that variable is set to false and the timer has paused. If we exit play mode again and go back into it, now our timer restarts because it's set to auto start. And as soon as we interact with it again, we can see that it pauses. So with that timer set up, we can go ahead and set the visibility to false. We'll just add another screen to our app, and I'll also add a data source. On this new screen, we'll go ahead and insert our component, and we'll just set it to stretch with a minimum width of 0, and we'll enable the flexible height option with a minimum height of 0. Now we've connected this tips and tricks SharePoint list, and this has some image columns that we can bring into our app and display in our banner. This would be helpful in case the information that you're trying to display in the banner is dynamic or changes often. You can point this to a SharePoint list and provide the image, title, and description that will then show up in the app. That way, when you make updates to the SharePoint list, you don't actually have to update the app itself. The only changes you'd have to make are really on the button actions, if the button is taking you to different screens in the app. But if your buttons are taking you out to external links, then those links could also be in the SharePoint list, and you could trigger the launch function for those links from the onSelect property of the carousel. But in this example, I'll show you how to simply add your SharePoint items to the carousel. We'll just get rid of some of these example items, and instead of a table function, we'll enter a for all function pointed to our tips and tricks SharePoint list. For all the records in our SharePoint list, we want to build this same record structure. So the item key in this case could simply be thisRecord.id. The title could be thisRecord.title. The description could be thisRecord.description. And we'll just leave click here as the button text, with the item image being thisRecord.banner.large. Just to be clear, the title and the ID column are just default columns inside of SharePoint, and my list specifically has a description column as well as a banner column. I don't want to necessarily stretch this component all the way across the screen, so in this case, maybe I want the maximum width to only go up to 900, for example, and we'll just center the banner inside of our container. If we play our app, we can see our banner is in the middle of the screen. And as we cycle through each option, we can see it loads the image from the SharePoint list, as well as the title and description of each of those items. In the case of there not being an image, then we're just shown a white background. We'll check one other thing. If we don't want any text to show for a button, or in other words, we want the button to disappear, we can simply set the text as blank, and now this is purely an informational display for our users. We'll try switching over to a mobile view, and we can see that our banner adjusts accordingly. Again, you can change the image position so that you decide how your images fill or fit the component. And that's about it. I hope you enjoyed this video looking at the Fluent 2 Carousel banner. This is one of those components that you can add to your toolbox that really just enhance the experience and the look and feel of your apps, and really aim to make them more website-like. Drop a comment below and let me know what your thoughts are on this component. If you liked it, give this video a like, and get subscribed for future videos like this one. I hope you enjoyed, and have a great day.